The Were-Raven is another creature that was requested by a viewer. Actually, Ellen has been on a requesting spree, personally filling the page I designated for a list of requests, thinking I'd never need more space. Just to clarify, I have no issue with this. If you'd like to spend your time coming up with dozens of creatures I have not covered yet and post them under my videos, have at it. However, me noting down a monster is no guarantee I'll ever actually make a video on it. With that being said, Ellen is in luck, as the Were-Raven seemed like a good candidate for V. Now, I had heard of this particular creature prior to beginning my research for this video, but I found out, much to my surprise, that not only is it a relatively recent invention, but not many English sources cover this Danish monster. I had to crack open the old auto-translator for this one, which either provides a grammatically perfect one-to-one translation of the text, or completely shits itself while trying to deal with words it previously had no trouble with. The titular Were-Raven switches from its actual name to being called a whale at the whims of the eldritch forces behind automated transcription, but I digress. I think I've got everything I need. One way to describe the Were-Raven is to say that it is a raven that turns into a human after consuming the flesh or heart of a person, be it a chieftain, woman, or child. There are variations as to the way this happens, but generally speaking, these ravens-made men have superhuman powers and a heightened intelligence. Contemporary art usually depicts them as either humanoid birds or just people wearing feathers and a crow's head or skull. However, there is nothing in the legends to indicate that they look any different from a normal person, except for the raven form, which seems to be quite large in some cases, but that's not a consistent or highlighted feature either. I've also found hints that there is supposed to be a half-wolf, half-raven version of the beast, but I could not gather any actual evidence or related citations, so I am somewhat doubtful of this form. The origin of the word, and possibly the concept of the creature, is very likely to be the ballad simply called Werevnen. It has multiple versions, including one titled Revnen, but the main motifs of the story are all shared. I found a handy little plot summary, but also took it upon myself to suffer through a few of the originals with the help of the translator. Narrowly escaping whiplash caused by the inconsistency of the software, I can confirm that the summary was correct. Naturally, I will try and retell the tale as concisely as possible. The titular Were-Raven was a person, the brother of a maiden called Ermeline. Their father remarried, but the new stepmother was actually a malevolent troll who decided to curse the children just for the hell of it. It is important to note that, contrary to their current image, trolls weren't always ugly, most often resembling humans with an odd feature here and there, so it is understandable that their father did not notice. In any case, the brother was turned into a raven, but would eventually turn back into a person once Ermeline has a daughter that can talk. Or in some cases, he regains his humanity once he drinks the heart blood of Ermeline's firstborn. The girl's lover or betrothed is also punished. He is turned into a silver gold bird, who can only gain back his humanity if he drinks the heart blood of Ermeline. This is not always the case, but you can already see how the details got hazy between versions. What's consistent though is that Ermeline is transported to an island where she awaits to marry the trollish stepmother's nephew, presumably another troll. However, the Were-Raven finds the girl and has a pretty good solution to all their problems. He promises Ermeline to take her away to her betrothed if she gives him her firstborn child. She agrees and climbs on the back of the bird. Based on this, the Were-Raven is presumably not a raven of ordinary size, but as I've said, most accounts do not suggest that there is anything unusual about the appearance of such a bird. They fly to the lover, at which point one of two things occurs. In the version where the lover was not transformed, nothing of note really happens, they simply wait for the first child. Although, if the lover is in the form of a bird, he immediately murders Ermeline, drinks her blood and transforms into a human. Lovely. However, Were-Raven carries the body to a magical spring that resurrects people, absolutely obliterating the stakes of the story. Nevertheless, Ermeline is dipped and emerges unhurt. In either case, Ermeline and the murderer's boyfriend have a baby girl. In some versions they forget their promise, in others they don't, but Were-Raven always comes and takes the child. In the versions where the child needs only to speak, the raven simply wishes she could, and so she gains the ability to talk, Were-Raven is turned back to a human and gives the child back. Man, this story has a lot of writing issues. On the other hand, if the heart blood of the child is needed for the transformation, the bird flies her away, pecks out her eyes, and tears into her chest to drink the blood. Well, maybe the first bit wasn't necessary, but it doesn't really matter. The now transformed Valraven dips the child into the life-giving puddle and she is revived, possibly with irreparable psychological damage, and thus every curse is broken and no one dies. Fundamental storytelling issues aside, this is possibly the oldest mention of the Valraven. It likely originates from the 1800s but was only recorded in the first couple of years of the 1900s by Axel Ulrich and a few associated scholars. As you can see, these Raven people are rather recent when it comes to folklore, but there are numerous other sources also mentioning them, highlighting that this particular ballad was quite influential. For example, Jacob Grimm in his 1844 treatise titled Teutonic Mythology mentions them as Vaid Raven or Vaid Varraven, briefly touching upon their appearance in Danish folk songs. He says they are the same as a troll, presumably a troll, but he's quite far from the truth there. There is also a presumably Latin name in here, Corvus Tragis. As far as I know, this is not an actual species. Also, the genus does not have a capital initial, so it might not even be a scientific name. I don't even know why I bothered to mention this. Does anyone even care? More than a century later, Evert Ten Christensen also recorded the folklore surrounding the Valraven, which seems to have evolved quite a bit over the years. He says that if the king or chief dies in battle, but their body is not retrieved, ravens would come and eat of them, which is pretty evident. However, if one was to eat the heart, it would gain human understanding, the ability to hurt or distort people, and superhuman power. Terrible animals they were, he recounts. The motifs of the ballad are still somewhat here, as the brother does transform into a big strong knight after drinking hard blood, but the tale has seemingly evolved since. Yet it does indeed seem to be the origin of these creatures. This pretty much covers all the credible sources that I could gather, not a long list, but there is still one thing we could speculate on. The Wolf-Raven hybrid is mentioned by several articles, including the one on Wikipedia. By the way, this citation text here is the Valraven ballad, which has nothing to do with wolves. Alas, there must be some reason this is perpetuated, or was even thought of. The best theory I can come up with, if this is indeed a made-up fact, is a misinterpretation of the name. Valraven is a composite word. Raven, as you might have guessed long ago, means raven. The Val portion could be translated as of the slain from Old Norse. This is not a very rare motif. For example, Valkyria means chooser of the slain, whom we now know as Valkyries. Valhall is Hall of the Slain, which is referred to as Valhalla nowadays. However, the name of the creature apparently has undergone a few distortions here and there, and versions like the Valraven also exist. This can be translated as Verraven, referring to its shape-shifting capabilities. However, this is rather close to werewolf both in name and concept, which might very well be the reason the two were animals were mixed. As to when this mix-up happened, and whether this is one of the original deviations of the Valraven or a modern misconception, that I cannot tell, unfortunately. With that said, I covered every bit of information I could find. You might be wondering why I use this interpretation of the Valraven at various points throughout the video instead of sticking to the more authentic, ordinary bloke look of legends. Well, it has to do with what I aim to attempt in the second half of the video. We've made quite a few monsters over the past year and a half on this channel, but nothing quite like this. We've had birds, we've had humanoids, but never both in one. Indeed, I aim to theorize such a creature. What's interesting about this combination is that while they have feathers, they do not possess wings and cannot fly either once transformed. Is it possible to have an avian creature that traded its flight for opposable thumbs and sapience? With the right circumstances. Now, I do not expect a bird to give up flight, have its wings atrophy, and regrow them as hands. That would be silly. I aim to go back further in time, nab an animal at the right evolutionary stage and help it achieve something resembling a Valraven. The animals in question belong to the Dromaeosauridae family, commercially called raptors. For the paleontologically gifted viewers out there, I know there is conflicting evidence as to the relationship of these dinosaurs and birds, but we are not necessarily aiming to make a conventional avian. In fact, we are about to follow the massive evolutionary changes of this raw material of a being, resulting in so many alterations it is practically irrelevant which exact taxonomic group we began with. Picture something not unlike a Deinonychus, both in size and appearance, but with front limbs less resembling wings. The specifics beyond these do not really matter as of yet. With this basis, we have a relatively easy task ahead. The arms are already off the ground. We just need to find a way to deter them from turning into wings. It's not a huge leap for a creature with 3 hands to adopt primitive tools. Even birds do it with their legs. While it is not exactly known how intelligent dromaeosaurs they were, let's assume our Valraven ancestor hit the mark. What would they use tools for though? Well, we could potentially make them scavengers, feeding on the carrion of contemporary animals instead of hunting for themselves. Bone marrow is a very valuable resource, especially that of animals as big as some dinosaurs. Few creatures have a powerful enough jaw to break bones, and any attempt with an implement not up for the task risks injury. However, what if the ancestors of the Valravens figured out that if you put a bone on a hard surface and smash it with a rock, the marrow becomes attainable? A similar tactic to the one used by bearded vultures who break bones they cannot swallow. These birds are quite large and have a specialized diet consisting of mostly marrow. This proves the feasibility of such feeding habits while giving a good reason to use rocks as tools. Such behavior can lead to heightened intelligence over time using more and more complex methods. Another aspect often associated with intelligence are social tendencies. Now, again, it is not clear whether or not Dromaeosauridae did actually hunt in packs, despite such notions perpetuated by our modern media. There are findings that suggest, however, that they at least showed some level of cooperation and may have even lived in groups or families. In order to enable their intellectual development, we need this to be true, for the Valraven ancestors at least. With a more advanced understanding of their world, a clear use for hands, and a lifestyle that relies more on carrion feeding than hunting, they begin to resemble our birdmen of legend more and more. Since running is less important, their stature can alter, aiding the use of their hands. The tail gradually disappears, their back straightens, hands become more sophisticated, the digitigrade legs slowly transform into plantigrade to better suit their needs, and the skull alters to allow for a larger brain. While their feathers help in maintaining their body temperature, be it shading from the sun or insulation from the cold, with the advent of clothing, their plumage is reduced to black patches at key areas. The claws are also reduced in prominence but remain part of their limbs as they are still rather useful, whether to tear flesh and skin or aid in crafting is up to the individual. Their large jaws themselves would change a little although, beside a slightly reduced size. While there is less emphasis on biting, it is not a useless asset, and since they take no flight, there is no need for a lighter beak. Well, they took quite a journey but did after all become rather humanoid. The best part about this is that all this seems like a very likely evolutionary sequence. The ancestor paired with the lifestyle I presented would likely arrive at something similar, even if sapiens might not be that probable of an addition. That being said, superhuman strength and their transformation would have to be embellishments made by bewildered humans. The second is outright impossible, while the first is rather unlikely. Since their size and stature does not deviate that much from those of a human, their physical capabilities would almost definitely be in the same ballpark as people. They'd be less reliant on hunting, but they'd still need strength to smash those bones or even fight, build, or craft. While the lore calls for it, I can't see them as a race of buff carrion feeders, as there's nothing in their day-to-day life that would require a more developed physique than that of a human living at that time, mind you. Scavenging would be their first means to sustain themselves, as hunting and gathering were for humans, but I could see them adapting some sort of animal husbandry later on. Carrion could still be a prominent part of their life for the bone marrow if not anything else. People could easily spot them feasting on or collecting the dead after battle. According to legends, they'd be living only around Denmark by the 19th century. Such a creature would likely be viewed as evil by humans, so a few genocides here and there are almost inevitable. Thus, even if the Valravens managed to spread from their cradle, which would likely be around Mongolia, China or Europe, their numbers would drop drastically once humans rise to prominence. A few relic populations could naturally survive, especially deep in the wilderness in isolated little societies, perhaps cohabiting with some more accepting folk. Danish legends do not unanimously agree whether they are to be respected or feared, but ballad tells of a cursed human and other tales talk of birds gifted with knowledge and power. It is not impossible that some would take kindly to these bird people, perhaps even revering them, telling stories of how they have ascended ravenhood. Still, if we go by their limited lore and habitat, they have a pretty low chance of surviving until the modern era. Genetic bottleneck as well as inbreeding are very real dangers they face, possibly causing their demise. I have no doubt in my mind that if such a humanoid and sapient creature would be discovered today, humans would try their best to help them. That is not something we could say for the majority of history though. If were-ravens would have been real, they'd likely be just another notch on humanity's path of species driven to extinction. That turns sour. Regardless, our doomed raven people turned out to be relatively plausible under the right circumstances. That's it for this video. As per usual, I'd like to invite anyone to my Discord server who hasn't joined yet. There's a lot of talk involving monsters and world building, so it's good fun if you are into those things. There's also still ongoing poll about the next creature I'll cover, unless the tie is already broken by the time this releases, so if you're swift enough, there might be a chance to influence the outcome. Regardless, hope to see you next time, bye!